Hey guys, and today I want to talk to you about pacing. Pacing is one of the most important aspects of game design in my opinion, and is one of the biggest challenges you will face when designing your game. So you've solved a problem and you've decided how you're going to motivate players to play your game, but how can we engage them? I talked about engagement beforehand, but in that video I mainly talked about the commonly used systems that many games use to build engagement. Now it's time to get more in depth and talk about pacing. Pacing is arguably the biggest factor that decides whether or not your game will be engaging. While it isn't the only factor, pacing can make or break a game, depending on how well it is implemented. Now I have previously brought up the terms real-time, synchronized time, and turn-based. These terms will be very important in this video as they are ultimately what will govern the style of pace you want for your game. The hard part comes with deciding how you want to pace your game, as not all games have explored these terms, and for good reason. A racing game could never work as a turn-based or synchronized time-based game because its core mechanism revolves around reaction time and dexterity, which contradicts a turn-based style of pacing. Nevertheless, pacing is a science which is yet to be fully explored, much like many other aspects of game design. I can, however, point out fundamental flaws in games where the pacing and the nature of the game contradict one another. Real-time strategy is essentially a flawed genre for this reason. While it is important to use time as a means of adding tension, a game that has too many things to manage will contradict its real-time pacing. However, if we separate the nature and the pacing of real-time strategy, we can clearly see that real-time and strategy are not incompatible by nature. Hence why it is not the genre, rather it is the games that are commonly labelled with the RTS genre that I have issues with. Real-time and strategy could possibly work together, but it would come at a cost. If you're going to make a game in real time, it needs to be adaptable to real-time gameplay. Too much management can compromise a real-time game, and as such, the inputs required to execute strategic choices need to be as straightforward as possible so that players can feel comfortable playing your game. One could argue that Final Fantasy XIII is closer to that of a real-time strategy than the turn-based strategy, and they wouldn't be wrong. The ATB bar is very similar to that of a unit production timer that you would usually see in a traditional RTS. On the other hand, I would argue that games like Grandia are closer to turn-based, as the game pauses when you are about to enter a command. Final Fantasy XIII's biggest flaw was the fact that it was forced to implement an auto-battle option in order for players to keep up with the pacing of the gameplay. As such, players would use that option over actually picking skills manually because of how its real-time influences the game's rules, as auto-battle is arguably the most efficient option due to the fact that picking skills manually forces them to navigate through menus, which wastes valuable time. In a turn-based game, this would never be the case, as the game pauses when you are navigating through the menu, which makes sense as navigating menus is a meaningless activity that has absolutely no connection to the player's strategic choice. As such, while Grandia may have an ATB gauge, the game works completely differently to Final Fantasy XIII, as the decision-making process isn't governed by real time. Final Fantasy XIII's is. This is what greatly differentiates the two. You could argue that Final Fantasy XIII was received poorly for this reason, because it didn't work. The question is, could it work? Well, that depends. Are you willing to narrow the number of choices in order to have a tighter level of control in your game to make up for it? The problem is, doing so could actually turn your game into an action game. Because even action games have some decision making involved, it just isn't as noticeable. There is a fine line between action and strategy that can be crossed if developers are not careful. This is where games labelled as RTS are flawed, as the outcome is often influenced more by the number of actions per minute than the decision-making process. Take Warcraft 3's 4 vs 4 for example. Due to the fact that large battles favour massing powerful units, certain units such as the Banshee become false choices, as they are lesser units designed to support more powerful units. This makes the decision-making process weaker. Most players will use frostworms, fiends, chimeras, hippogriffs, siege engines, mortar teams and bats, depending on their race. Because Warcraft 3 suffers from a lot of balancing issues, the outcome of a 4 vs 4 game is usually influenced by what races are on what team. But if you were to play in an all-undead mirror game, the team with the most combined action per minute wins. As such, Warcraft 3 is not a strategy game anymore, it is an action game. Then we have synchronized time. Synchronized time is where time moves when the player inputs certain actions. In other words, the pacing of the game can vary from slow to fast depending on how quickly the player acts. While this might seem like a good thing at first, it's important to remember that synchronized time changes the rules considerably from real time, and unlike turn-based, it wouldn't really work in a multiplayer game. In addition to all this, it's important to note that certain genres just wouldn't work well with synchronized time, because it would contradict their very nature. Games like Mountain Blade, Valkyrie Profile 2, Mystery Dungeon, and Superhot all use synchronized time in some shape or form. Now that we've covered the basic pacing methods, it's time to refine them. In order to do this, we need to find an answer to a more complicated question. How does the pacing of a game differ between two games which use the same style of pacing? Since this is a lot to take in, I'm going to aid you in the process of solving this issue, and as such I have come up with a guideline. Not a be-all and end-all, but a guideline on how to decide what style of pacing you want your game to have, so you can clearly understand what this process involves, and how important it really is. This guideline focuses on two aspects of a game which are polar opposites. In terms of racing games, for example, supporting mechanisms make up these two opposite ends of the spectrum. On one hand, you have games which focus on control, and on the other hand, you have games which focus on building up speed. I can safely say that all racing games need both mechanisms to function, but one is usually going to outclass the other. This is where the decision-making process comes in. Now, the guideline suggests that games on either end of the spectrum are going to be niche. However, for the sake of brevity, let's say that this guideline is used to judge how good a game is. Let's say that games on the opposite side of the spectrum are the best games in their genre. Let's use first-person shooters as an example. On one end of the spectrum, you have games like Arma and Half-Life. On the other end, you have games like Quake and Painkiller. Now, that's not to say that Arma and Half-Life are the same, because they're very different, but so are Painkiller and Quake. Each game has its own identity which separates it from the other. What these games share with one another is not the style of gameplay, but rather the pacing of the game. In Half-Life, you spend a good portion of the game roaming the maps, hunting for ammunition and solving puzzles. In Arma, you spend a lot of time positioning yourself in strategic positions, as well as carefully aiming your weapon. Quake and Painkiller, on the other hand, has you firing off bullets like there's no tomorrow, and you will be moving very quickly through levels, dodging bullets and other hazards like a god. Now, it's no secret that Painkiller was heavily inspired by Quake 2. You could even argue that it's Quake 3's true single-player campaign, as its mechanics are very close to that of Quake 3's. The level structure, however, is different. Painkiller is more linear, with large open arenas to fight in. Quake is more contained and maze-like. One thing is for certain though, both games are fast and will require a lot more reaction timing to master. Arma, on the other hand, requires more precision. While both games require a form of dexterity, it is merely the way in which players utilise their dexterity that differs, and this completely changes not only the pacing, but the entire nature of the gameplay experience as a whole. As such, you can clearly see how important pacing is. Pacing can transform games. As a result, you have to be very careful with how you decide to pace your game. Does it fit in with your vision? This is the hardest question of them all, because you might have the vision for the perfect game, only for it to be ruined by poor pacing. As such, you have yourself a dilemma. This is why pacing is so difficult, because you don't want to waste valuable resources trying to make a solid game, only for it to fall apart because you realise that the pacing and the vision do not fit together. Then you have to rethink everything all over again and scrap the project. To alleviate this issue, it might be important to pick the style of pacing first before you pick a vision. It sounds counterintuitive, but believe me, you won't regret it. This will narrow down the scope of your vision drastically. But this also helps you make a more calculated decision when it comes to designing your vision. Afterwards, all you need to do is make sure the vision and your style of pacing work in tangent. In order to do so, you need to come up with creative mechanisms, ideally ones which kill two birds with one stone. Remember that the less mechanisms your game relies on, the less you will have to put in your game, and the more simple and accessible your game will be. In addition, dealing with too many mechanisms can be costly, and time is precious, so it's very important to be creative with your ideas in order to hit that sweet spot. I hope this has been either helpful or interesting for you guys, and I'll see you all later.